Welcome to today's webinar, and today we're going to talk about a major upgrade of the Servoy grid component that is used in the NG client, and Sean is going to show everything about it and talk about it. And again, as usual, we'll be here to answer any and all of your questions, so feel free to post them during the webinar in the questions channel, and we will take them either during or at the end of the webinar. There's quite some content to cover. So Sean, let's get started with number 40. Welcome.
Thank you, Jan. You can see my screen okay?
Yes, we can all see your screen.
Excellent. I want to also point out before I forget that this announcement also coincides with the availability of Servoy version 8.3.1, which is available now as a release candidate. So we're looking for you all to please download and try it out. The more feedback we get, the more bugs we can fix before we put it to the stable version. So today we are happy to announce a new web package, a new suite of components available for the platform. We're calling it the Servoy NG Grid components. And what we include here is sort of a multi-purpose component set that allows you to do typical things that you have in a business application with respect to grids. Now, as is the tradition in the Servoy Tech webinar series, we're going to begin with a demo and show you a few things. What I plan to show you are two different grid modes. One is the data grid, which involves being able to do typical grid stuff, including grouping and also now editing. The second demo is going to be what we call the power grid, which is similar, but it is involving summaries, so being able to aggregate data how you like as a user and also as a developer, and also what we call pivot mode, so being able to see aggregates in 2 dimensions. So let's get to the demo. So what we're looking at here is a grid which is generated from a backend relational database table, the Northwinds orders table. And so I point out a few things here. The functionality of the grid. First of all, it's like other components in Servoy, which are data bound. It's bound directly to a backend data source, which means you don't ever have to worry about paging or caching. That is built in, so we have infinite scrolling as you go through the orders. You can continue to scroll. Because it's data bound, you can use all of the Servoy business objects that you're used to, such as relations, calculations, formats, etc. So I would point out here that although we're looking at the orders table, the column here for customer and sales rep are both joined in via relations, as well as we have a format on these 2 columns for date and the total itself is a calculated value. So all of the stuff that you would normally expect are available on the grid. The functionality inside the grid from the user's perspective is what I hope they would expect. They can do things like drag to reorder. They can click sort. We also support multi-column sort, so if you were to select several columns, you can see that now we're sorting by multiple columns at the same time, and you can change or remove any of them by holding down the Shift key. There is, if I move my GoToMeeting console here, there's a tool panel out here to the right, which you can show optionally, and here we can also turn off and on columns. And we can also, let's say we want to turn off the date column and the sales rep column and resize. So we can also click drag to resize. Say make our customer column bigger and our country column very small. And if I wanted to save the state of that, I'll click the Save State button. And now if I were to log out and log back in, I would expect as this user that I would see the grid as I have left it. So you can see that the columns that I've turned off are preserved, as well as the widths that I had resized. So that's built into the component. Now, how you save that, or rather where you save that and when, is entirely up to you. So in this case, I was just saving the column state into local web storage, so on the browser's local storage. This would be something you might do automatically so that as you come back in, all your grids could be the same as you last left them. But it could be that it's something you want across all devices or all machines that you log in from. So you may want to serialize that into a column in a database connected to the user that's logged in, or maybe you do it on a tenant basis or a group basis. It's entirely up to you. Now, we can do a bit of grouping here as well, and there's a couple ways to do it. So let's say I wanted to see this data set grouped by country. I could drag down here into my row groups. I could also click the little context menu here and group by the customer as well. So now you can see that I could see all the distinct customers, as well as expanding that, I get the exploded records within that group. I could group by multiple groups as well. So if I wanted to add city there, now I can group by city. And you can see that, I think it makes sense to, I thought I did country. Let's do country and city. That makes a bit more sense. And maybe let me drag this over. I guess it doesn't really make sense to have the country or the city turned on if you're grouping by it. That's why I'm confusing myself. So we could turn those off so they don't clutter the view. So now you can see that we can expand countries and cities. Now, I would point out that this is infinite grouping, as we like to call it. So this is really still bound to the backend data source, meaning this will work on a table, a very large table, a table with millions of rows, where the results of a group could be very large. We're paging that in and managing that for you, because this is connected to Servoy's backend caching mechanism. So again, you don't have to worry about how large the data set is for this type of component. Again, this is because it's a data-bound component, all of the other traditional tools are available to you, such as searching, filtering, working with related data, etc. So I could say I'm looking for all orders fulfilled by a certain sales rep. Might help if I do this. So you can see that the sales rep here is fuller, and that will still be preserved as I go into grouping mode. So if I wanted to see everything that Fuller sold to by country, you can see that all of the results here still have that same sales rep. I could clear the search. And I believe when it's grouped, I have to refresh, which I didn't do, but if I sort of ungroup it and regroup it, we should get the same effect. So now you can see that it's back to all sales reps. So again, any of the typical data APIs that you're used to working with in Servoy will work in this grid as well. Finally, what I'd like to show about this grid is that it's now editable. So some of these columns are editable and some are not. What I've done is I've made the city and the country and the date editable, and you can see that I can tab through these. I can shift tab through these. There's different editor types, so I could use a date picker, say for the order date, and change that. I can come in here and type this to another city, another country, etc. Because this is data bound, saving typical CRUD management works the same as it does in all of your other data bound Servoy components. There's also data change events too, so as you type and you tab off of fields, you can handle the data changes as you see fit. Another thing that works on this grid, and I'll switch over to, excuse me, to the developer, the IDE, put this in HTML5 view. Let's say, for example, on our column for customers, right now you can see that I'm showing orders to customers.company name. So I'm using that relation object here to get data from the other table. Let's say I wanted to make that editable, and perhaps I want to put that to just a customer ID, and I'll change the edit type to type ahead and apply a value list. So now when I come back and I begin editing in here, you can see that I get the value list, so I could change. I could change the customer for that order just by clicking in and getting the value list. So value lists are also supported in the editor and showing in the grid. What I'd like to show next is another mode of the grid. We call this the power grid. And in this situation, in this example, I think I've done something that it didn't like. I'm going to relaunch in terms of I made some edit that it didn't care for. So let me switch to the power grid now. And in this example, we're showing a bunch of related data, but however, this is coming from a query and sent to the grid. So this is not really connected to the backend data source. The whole purpose of this grid is a little bit different, although the implementation looks almost the same and many of the features are common to the other grid I just showed you. This is more for doing inquiry and analysis. So what I've done is put a bunch of fields on this grid, which we could group by, but I put a couple fields here, units and sales, and maybe I should move these out here because it will look better. So these are looking at individual order items, items that were ordered. And so let's say I want to do some kind of sales analysis. I can get in here and I can start to say group by product category. So now you can see that I have 366 dairy products that I sold, and drag this over here. And you can see the dollar amount here in total sales and the number of units sold. And even though those are aggregates, those are also sortable. So I could sort this descending and really show you, the top grossing product categories that I have. I could further group this and say I want to drag product up here. And so now when I expand one of these groups, you can see that it's aggregated also by product. So within the grains and cereals product category, I can look at the individual products and I can see the breakdown both in the number of orders that they appear on and their aggregate values for the individual products here. Another nice feature is that I could turn this into a pivot mode. So I'm going to click that and I'm going to turn on the year, which I've set in the configuration as a column group instead of a row group. And so now if I want to look at my product sales, so for example, how much dairy product I've sold in total, but also throughout each year. So separated here by 1996, 1997, 98 coming from the data, and I can look at the units and the sales for each item even as I expand. So pivot mode is also possible. What I'd like to do now is switch back and just do a few slides of overview and talk a bit about this new web package. So I showed you two different implementations. The first one being what we call the data grid, and the main aspect of this is that it's really connected to the backend data source. So we can support very large tables. Paging is automatic. When we expand groups, the groups are paged in automatically for you. So even if a group could have, a large number of members, it's not a problem. In fact, the grid is also updatable. You can use this to edit with, and it's fully data bound. So everything that you're used to, if you have been using Servoy, is available. Such as you saw the related values, you saw value lists. It will both initiate and update from data broadcasts. You saw there was a calculation on the end for the order total. We saw some fields that were using formatting, and I showed you how we connected to the text-based searching API to easily limit the results inside the grid. So pretty much you can just put this on the form and plug it into your backend data sources and start working with it. The second grid I showed you is more for an analytic type thing. And the biggest difference between this and the first one, you could think of it is you're working with a finite data set. So the first example I showed, doesn't matter how many rows are in the back-end database, it's basically going to load those on demand. The second one, because we're doing summaries inside the component, we do have to get all of the results up front and then give it to the component. So that means that you would generate the data source in advance. So what I did is I used Servoy's Query Builder API. I queried out the values that you had seen, the columns and the values that you'd seen, and I gave it to the grid to work with. And there is a limit to that. You can work with up to 100,000 records. Of course, that depends on if you had many columns that could go down, or if the machine you were working on was the client machine was very limited, that number could change. But it really gives the end user analytic capabilities. The key difference is you can do summaries in this one. So in the first grid I showed you, where it has the infinite scrolling and infinite grouping, we couldn't do summaries in the component with that. But when we use this version and we have the data up front, then we can do dynamic summaries, let the user group and summarize how they please, and also enter the pivot mode where you can do column grouping and row grouping seen together. Some of the features that are common to both, and I didn't get into everything because this is supposed to be kind of a quick overview. Both grids can do grouping. The columns behave the same in both, so you can drag, reorder, resize. You can turn columns off and on with the little pop-out tool panel. You can configure the collapse and expand icons and those sorts of things. You can configure the way this grid displays completely with CSS. All the columns are click sortable, or they will also render what the sort is of the underlying data set that you're using. So if it's already pre-sorted, it should render in the grid as that. You can do multi-column sorting, as I showed you, by shift clicking. You can also persist the state of the grid, and that applies to both grids. So at any point you can save out the column state of the grid, and at any point you could restore it or revert it back to what the design was, which is not something that I showed, but that's easy to do. You can dynamically style rows and cells based on values. So let's say I was looking at a list of products, and for discontinued products, I wanted to show the background is gray or something like that. That's perfectly easy to do in this using a dynamic row or cell style class. And as I showed you, there's a built-in tool panel, so you can the user can drag or to group or turn columns on or off. As far as editing goes, currently we support the following editor types. Possibly in the future we would add more, but that would be sort of per request. We have to see what's being demanded from the community. But right now it's you don't have to have the fields be editable, of course, but if you do, then it's pretty much text field, date pickers, and combo box and type ahead. One thing that I didn't really show, but that is supported, is the event model. So we support all the clicks, as well as whenever the grid state changes. And by grid state, I mean not the data, but the structure of the grid. If you were to reorder columns, resize them, change the grouping, etc., that would trigger an event. So you could, although I put a button on the screen to save state for demo purposes, I could just do it in background. As the user changes it, I always want to save it so the next time they come in, it's exactly how they left it. Also, of course, because we're editing, we want to support data change, just like all the other editing paradigms in Servoy. So anytime you're typing in a field and you tab off of it after a data change or click out, you will get an event. I'm going to leave up some useful links here. I didn't go under the hood too much into the IDE. Perhaps we could do that if there are questions that warrant it, but I see there's a lot of questions coming in, so I'll stop now and leave some room for questions. And again, I'll leave these links up with some useful links about this webinar series and also the project home for this project.
Cool. Quite impressive, this grid. There's a question from Quail. Is there a big performance hit on having a lot of columns editable?
No, there's not really a large performance hit on editable columns. I've seen it with quite many more columns on it, and it edits and performs really well. So I haven't seen that. In the data set, in the sort of the power grid, where it's the kind of coming from a data set that's offline or already been pre-cached, there is a performance limitation on really the number of rows you could use. So the one that's used for analysis for summaries and pivot, if you get up over 100,000 base rows, then you may run into some performance issues.
Okay.
And that could also change based on the number of columns you have, of course.
And another question is, are buttons supported in the data grid? So if you wanted a button that links to a detail view?
Buttons themselves are not currently supported. So right now it is those values plus the editors. We do support images or font icons. So that would be an option. So not quite a real HTML button, but an image. And of course we support the click event. So if you were to click an image to go to a detail view, that's definitely supported, or double click on a row or anything like that.
Yeah, the double click event may make most sense from a UX point of view. Then there is another question, and for the audience, feel free to post some more questions if you have questions or you would like to see stuff in the IDE, then post that as a question, please. Does the traditional Servoy table component can the traditional Servoy table component be completely replaced by this grid component?
Yeah, I'm glad that question was asked, because I wanted to make sure I mentioned that. This does almost effectively replace the traditional Servoy table view, not the table component, which is really there's a third component that we've had available for some time, which is very high performing read-only data grid. So if you're doing a read-only view, I would use that component because the performance is much higher. But if you need to do it doesn't do grouping, it doesn't do editing. But there is the sort of the legacy table view form for those veterans out there, which if you wanted to do editing in the NG client up until this point, you would have had to use that. This can effectively replace that. There will be a few feature differences. I think there's a few editors that aren't yet supported in this that would be supported in the classic editor. But I think, going forward, that the aim is to replace that table view form with this component.
Okay, so is your conclusion, if you need a simple read-only table, then use the table component, and otherwise use this component if you're using NG client?
Correct.
Okay, and the question from John, can the grid be made responsive?
Yes, you can make the grid responsive. You can also set the responsive height of the component as well. So if you need this in a responsive container, it will work.
Okay, excellent. How easy is it to change an existing table to one of these new grids?
Well, I guess that depends a bit. An existing table, meaning a table view form, is also a form. So there's lots of code behind it, potentially, etc. But in another example I've done with this grid in proof of concepts with Servoy prospects and customers, we were auto-generating this grid based on the data model. So looking at all the columns in the data model, or looking at some metadata and completely dynamically generating these grids. And that's also a possibility. So if you can do that, then you could even automate the generation of a grid component from a legacy table view. I think that would be possible.
Okay, so for base table editing, you would recommend creating a more dynamic way to do it so that you don't have to create a form per table view?
Well, you no longer have to create a form. Yeah, you can do this as a component on a form, which I didn't show, but I could have, in addition to that grid, put a bunch of fields on the form as well, and they would be automatically synced. So it does also reduce the number of forms you need. And it's up to you if you wanted to do it dynamically or at design time. Everything I did here was at design time, but we've done other implementations where it's generated from code.
Right. So all the stuff you did now at design time can also be done at runtime using JavaScript functions.
Everything, yep.
Cool. Let's see here. I think we've answered most questions. If there are any last-minute questions, please post them quickly. When is the next webinar, Sean?
Before we get to that, I do want to say that this component is available now. If you go to your web package manager in the IDE, if you right-click the web package manager or right-click the web packages and open up the manager, you will see it under the Servoy NG Grids web package. And this is, we're calling this a release candidate. So we would like your feedback to help us improve this offering before we put this to the final release of this component. The next webinar is scheduled July 25th, and right now it's to be determined. Look for some messages in the IDE. We now push messages out to the IDE with regular updates of events and notifications. If you are using Servoy 8.2 and above, you will get those notifications in the IDE. And we will announce the webinar again and the topic. We have a few topics that have been floating around, so we just have to pick one.
Excellent. And if anybody has suggestions for topics, then please join us in the forum. There is a general forum thread to discuss and talk about the tech webinar series. So feel free to join the discussion over there, or if you have any questions about today's session after this webinar, we will post the recording shortly. Thanks all for attending, and Sean, thank you again for presenting.